All right. Hey, everybody. This is Andy coming at you once more with the Modern Military History Podcast. This is podcast number 9, and it's another book. It's another week here in 2021. I'm going to share with you folks today a book that, like last week when we looked at Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie, a Marine veteran of the 1st Marine Division who served in the Pacific throughout the majority of the 1st Marine Division's campaigns in the Second World War. A very famous book in its own right. We are looking at another book that has become incredibly well-known and renowned, and has been for a really long time. This book is canon amongst those who study the First World War and those who seek veterans' memoirs for a first-hand account regarding battles that they study. So we're looking today at Storm of Steel, written by Ernst Junger. Ernst Junger is just a name that is prolific amongst First World War historians. He is somebody that is quoted in so many works, so many secondary sources. He has become magnanimous, one may say, in terms of his account of serving with the Imperial German Army from 1914 all the way through 1918. This is due to a couple reasons, a couple simple factors. First of all, Ernst Junger, much like Robert Leckie, was a writer before he entered the service in World War I. Junger was born to an affluent family in Western Germany, I believe. He was seen as a burgeoning young poet before his military service, so he was already not only literate, but highly literate. And at the beginning of the 1900s, early 20th century, that in itself was not common, or as common as it is today. So his writing today is prevalent, A, because he could write, and write well, and it has become a literary canon in its own right as a written work. But also, the nature of Mr. Junger remains to be one of the most compelling facets of his memoir. And this hopefully will become apparent as we plunge into the book. Again, I have 3 selections from the book that I think we all can learn a little bit from, and hopefully will sell the book, for lack of a better phrase, to you, the listener. I think anybody who is studying the First World War needs to get this book and read it. Another factor as to why Mr. Junger is successful in his writing is because he was present in the Imperial Army from the beginning of the war, 1914, all the way clear through to some of the last offensive actions the German Army undertook in 1918. He was wounded multiple times throughout his service. He was highly decorated. In 1918, he was actually severely wounded. He was shot through the chest during an assault on enemy trenches, and that ended his career once and for all. So not only do we have a well-written book, we have a book that is written by somebody with an incredible war record. So those factors combined have really made this book stalwart in terms of its continued applicability to the historical record. It's continuously seen as a pivotal work. And something I just want to add in here is that the phrase history is written by the victors is cliche, and I am not a fan of cliches. However, when it comes to the popular conception of the First World War, when you really start getting into it and begin to take note, the history written regarding the First World War is incredibly ally-centric. The majority of the photographs you're going to find during, web searches for the First World War and battles are taken by British photographers or French photographers or American photographers. The vast majority of books are written with upwards of 75% of the content revolving around the Allied experience against the Germans. It's very, very prevalent when you begin to really look for the German side of things. At least it was for me when I started getting very interested in the First World War. I found myself looking for German stuff to read, and it just wasn't out there. The vast majority of my history books on battles were all regarding the efforts fighting the Germans. Very little, if anything, there would be like an afterthought thrown in there. I can think of multiple works right now off the top of my head that we can get into, later, maybe different podcasts, that, just as an afterthought, there's a chapter or two regarding the German experience of that battle. But it's an incredible trivialization of 50% of the men who went through the horror of the First World War. Yes, the Germans lost. Yes, they were aggressors. Yes, there's this common conception that the Germans were the quote-unquote bad guys of the First World War. But I believe in more nuanced approaches, and instead of a black and white good guy, bad guy kind of thing, I really like to look at history as shades of gray. So it's important, as anybody studying history, let alone military history, to do their utmost to get both sides of the story before you can make definitive value judgments. And I think part of learning about the other side of things, so to speak, is to understand where somebody's coming from as a writer. It helps you understand their writing and take much more from it than you would if you were just reading it from your own perspective of where you are as a person, where you've grown up. We all take both implicit and explicit value judgments to to absolutely everything we do as humans. And when you're reading somebody else's work, it's very important. It's very important to consider who they are, where they are coming from, to be able to then understand what they're telling you. I found that Ernst Junger wrote about his war experience in a much different way than I have read about, than I have read in other, mostly Western, as in, American or British accounts of the First World War. Ernst Junger is a military man. He is somebody, in his book, Ernst Junger has passed away. I speak about him in the present because his book is still with us and his voice is still within those pages. And that's how I'm interacting with him. It's almost like he's speaking to me through his book. That's how I engage memoirs. So forgive me if I'm speaking about him in the present tense, but Ernst Junger's voice is very militaristic in terms of how he's explaining his service. It's a jarring perspective to take as you're reading, especially if you, like me, are quite removed from the society that Junger was born into. Junger was born in the late 19th century, in Western Germany into a affluent Prussian family. And to understand Junger, you have to understand his upbringing. And I did a little bit of research about who Junger was before I did this podcast, because I knew I was going to have to say something about how Junger writes and how he accounts for his service and the things he did, the people he killed, the actions he took part in, and the tone he has with that. I knew I was going to have to say something, so I wanted to do it right. So I read quite a bit about Ernst Junger just to give you guys a kind of a glimpse into who he is as a person. I mean, some of the things that I came away with before I did this research, after I had just read the book, are actually fleshed out in the introduction of my edition. I have a Penguin Classics Storm of Steel edition with the introduction written by a German poet who also does quite a bit of translation work, and his name is Michael Hoffman. Michael Hoffman did the translation for my edition, as well as wrote the introduction. And the introduction that Mr. Hoffman wrote has some elements in there that certainly are relevant to my own takeaways after initially reading Ernst Junger's book. At one point in the introduction, Michael Hoffman describes how Ernst Junger recounts his first kill in the war. He kills an English soldier on the field of battle, and describes, killing him and watching him fall and fold up like a knife. He says he folds up like a knife, I believe. And Michael Hoffman, the German translator and the guy who wrote the introduction to my edition, described this as bloodlust. And I initially disagreed with this take, but after researching Junger, I formulated how I was going to back up my disagreement into words. And the best way I can do that is just to say that when you're reading somebody's memoir, it's best to avoid value judgments, because your value judgments are coming from your own experience as a person, your own formulative experiences early in life, the society you grew up in. Especially when you're looking at somebody who was born over 100 years ago, you have to understand that their life experiences and who they were as a person was formulated under vastly different circumstances. They're still people. Just like you and me, but you have to humble your opinion, and you have to kind of humble yourself and step back. And I find the term bloodlust as a damning, kind of a damning observation of somebody. And I don't find Ernst Junger as somebody who has a bloodlust. I found Ernst Junger to be somebody who grew up in a Prussian family, is a very militaristic person. This is definitely evidenced by the fact that when he was 18, Ernst Junger ran away from home to join the French Foreign Legion, and he signed up for a full 5-year service contract. After less than a year, his father, Ernst Junger's father, actually pulled some strings in Germany with the German Foreign Office to get Ernst Junger discharged from the Foreign Legion and brought back to Germany in time for the First World War, because that would have been, I'm sure, difficult for this affluent family in Germany to have their son fighting against the fatherland with the French Foreign Legion, So in 1913 he ran away, and by 1914 he was back and actually was able to volunteer again for the military, but this time on the German side, and march off to war. So we're looking at somebody who the military was how he grew up. It was where he grew up, and the military way of thinking embedded in his personality. Prussian virtues are often seen as now German virtues, and these are typically seen as like efficiency, austerity, and discipline. These are like the three big Prussian virtues that I find Junger exemplifies, especially through his militaristic methods of describing his service. So it makes a lot of sense that when he's describing acts in battle, he adheres to these virtues, these Prussian virtues. And I find Ernst Junger incredibly efficient and very austere about how he describes the taking of life. What Mr. Hoffman wrote in the introduction regarding a bloodlust, I believe, was founded from... It stems from the fact that Junger didn't fall over himself apologizing, feeling ashamed about what he did. He simply recounts shooting a man, watching him fall, describing how he fell. And as somebody who, I grew up in America in the early 2000s. That's when I came of age. It's very different from how I've been taught to treat, the taking of human life. But when you grew up in the military, when you're from a Prussian background where military service is everything, means a great deal to your honor, to who you are, it makes perfect sense. Without further ado, I appreciate you, listener, kind of suffering through my explanation there at the beginning of this podcast of who Ernst Junger is and why I find his writing to be the way it is. Hopefully now you're armed appropriately to approach not only the passages I'm going to share in the podcast today, but also if you go and pick up a copy of this book for your own reading, for your own library, which I highly recommend. I will include links, as always, to Amazon. If you want to support a local business rather than Amazon, by all means, I anticipate they're going to have this book. This book's everywhere, and it's cheap, too. It's been printed a whole lot. So it's easy to get a hold of. The copy I have is like $16. I'm sure you can get it cheaper used. That being said, thanks for listening to the introduction. When we're taking primary sources into account, we always want to look at who's writing it and why they are coming at these events the way that they are. Then you're able to avoid undue judgments on their character, undue judgments on their history, and look a little bit more objectively at what they're trying to say. So, let's dive into the book. My first selection from Storm of Steel is it sets the stage, so to speak, for what a German accounting of trench warfare is like. Ernst Junger, towards the beginning of his book, does a wonderful job explaining, with all of his literary prowess, what the trenches looked like, what it was like to enter the trenches for the first time and be there. So I'm going to let Ernst Junger's own writing take us to the front line on the German side of things in France towards the beginning of the war. This is what the trenches were like. To reach the front line, the firing trench, we take one of the many SAPs, or communication trenches, whose job it is to afford the troops some protection on their way to battle stations. These often very long trenches are broadly perpendicular to the front, but to make it less easy to rake them with fire, they most often follow a zigzag or curving course. After a quarter of an hour's march, we enter the second trench, the support trench, which is parallel to the firing trench, and serves as a further line of defense that should be taken. The firing trench is wholly unlike those frail constructions that were dug in the early days of the war. Nor is it just a simple ditch either, but it is dug to a depth of 10 or 20 feet. The defenders move around as on the bottom of a mine galley to observe the ground in front of the position, or to fire out, They climb a set of steps or a wide wooden ladder to the sentry platform, which is set at such a height in the earth that a man standing on it is a head taller than the top of the rampart. The marksman stands at his sentry post, a more or less armored niche, with his head protected by a wall of sandbags or a steel plate. The actual lookout is through a tiny slit through which a barrel rifle is pushed. The quantities of earth that were dug out of the trench are piled up in a wall behind the trench, a parados affording protection from the rear. Machine gun emplacements are built into these earthworks. On the front side of the trench, the earth is kept level, so as to leave the field of vision as clear and uncluttered as possible. In front of the trench, often in multiple lines, is a wire entanglement, a complicated web of barbed wire designed to keep the attacker busy so that he presents an easy target for the defensive sentries. Rank weeds climb up through the barbed wire, symptomatic of a new and different type of flora taking root on the fallow fields. Wild flowers of a sort that generally make only an occasional appearance in grain fields dominate the scene. Here and there even bushes and shrubs have taken hold. The paths, too, are overgrown, but easily identified by the presence on them of round-leaved plantains. Bird life thrives in such wilderness. Partridges, for instance, whose curious cries we often hear at night, or larks, whose choir sets up at first light over the trenches. To keep the firing trench from being raked by flanking fire, it's laid out in a meandering line, forever doubling and tripling back on itself. Each of these turns forms a traverse to catch any shells fired from the side. The fighter is thus protected from behind, from the side, and, of course, from the front. To rest in, there are dugouts, which have been evolved by now from rudimentary holes in the ground to proper enclosed living quarters with beamed ceilings and plank-cladded walls. The dugouts are about 6 feet high and at a depth where their floor levels are roughly level with the bottom of the trench outside. In effect, there is a layer of earth on top of them thick enough to enable them to survive oblique hits. In heavy fire, though, they are death traps, and it's better to be in the depths of the shelters. The shelters are braced with solid wood joints. The first is fixed in the front wall of the trench, level with the bottom, and from this entrance, each successive joist is set up a couple of hands' breadths lower, so that the amount of protection is rapidly increased. By the 13th step, there are 9 yards of earth overhead, 12 counting the depth of the trench. Then there are slightly wider frames set straight ahead or perpendicular to these steps. These constitute the actual living quarters. Communication is therefore by lateral tunnels, while branchings off towards the enemy lines are used for mining or listening posts. The whole thing should be pictured as a huge, ostensibly inert installation, a secret hive of industry and watchfulness where, within a few seconds of an alarm being sounded, every man is at his post. But one should not have too romantic an idea about the atmosphere. There is a certain prevailing torpor that proximity to earth seems to engender. So that's the first selection from Storm of Steel that I wanted to share with you, because Ernst Junger just does a wonderful job explaining in detail what German trench systems were like. They had an incredible amount of engineering gone into them. They had firing positions, deep trenches, dugouts that were in themselves little like living quarters. Mr. Junger being a first non-commissioned officer, and then a full-fledged lieutenant, I believe. Ernst Junger as a non-commissioned officer, and then eventually as an actual officer, lived in one of these dugouts to himself. So he spent a lot of time in one of those. That's where a lot of this book takes place, is, him meeting his fellow officers and whatnot in one of these dugouts between actions. But also they're alongside the dugouts, alongside the trench and the various aspects of the trench system there are these massive underground bunkers, living complexes that are completely sheltered from fire. As he says, they're over 9 yards underneath the ground, shod with timber, often concrete, poured for these labyrinths. If you've seen the movie 1917, the part where they're going underground and almost, get entombed therein due to a booby trap, that's exactly historically accurate. It's massive underground earthworks, dugouts, which troops can fully survive artillery barrages within. Now, this passage of the book is not only descriptive in terms of just showing you what trench life is like, it shows you what German trenches were like. The Allied trenches were not like this at all. Yes, they were dug in the ground. Yes, they were also in their own way very complex with different systems and sections and things that operated to support one another. But the Allies never put in the effort that the Germans put into, as Ernst Junger puts it, these massive permanent fixtures. The Allies never did that because they were of the offensive mindset that their trenches were going to be temporary and that the Germans needed to be pushed out, that these lines could never be made comfortable enough and through the action of making substantial fortifications on Allied trenches concede that, they were going to be in those positions for very long because they wanted to garner this offensive mindset. And unfortunately for the Allies, they still spent years often in the same trench lines. And unfortunately, their lack of engineering compared to the Germans that Junger explains cost a lot more lives because when artillery would come in, they did not have these massive underground bunkers that the Germans did, and nor did the Allies have the same commitment to troop comfort that the Germans did. The Germans, again, they were there, they had captured the amount of ground that they were going to at this point in the war, and they wanted to make their front lines as robust as possible so that they could hold that land. So the very nature of what Junger is describing is emblematic of the nature of the fighting of the First World War. So again, it is bringing you the other side of that conflict in a way that just is not accessible through Allied-centric works. You got to read the memoirs from the other side is the point that I'm making with this podcast. And Junger is just really wonderfully, with his literary prowess, bringing us. The next passage I want to read you is a short passage that Junger is writing in regards to the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. That's actually the title of the chapter here. And, the Battle of the Somme, a famous battle from the First World War, is very, very Allied-centric in terms of how it is taught, how it is written about. We know about the horrible Allied losses. We know about the Allied mines. We know about the general failure of the Allies to take ground in the Somme compared to their losses, compared to their efforts. But Junger provides a rather rare, by comparison, look at what it was like to be a German soldier on the receiving end of the Somme offensive. And by all accounts, it was not at all enjoyable from his side of things either. So again, it's humanizing the conflict through being able to show us both sides of the story. Junger writes, "The British had let off clouds of gas and smoke at 5 a.m. and had gone on to rattle our trench with mortar fire. Our soldiers, as was their custom, had leapt out of their shelters while the bombing was still in progress, and we had taken more than 30 casualties. Then, still hidden in the smoke, 2 large British raiding parties had appeared, one of which had got into the trench and taken a wounded NCO of ours. The other never made it past the wire entanglement. The single exception, Brecht, who, before the war, had been a plantation owner in America, now, seized by the throat, had greeted with the words, "Come here, you son of a bitch." The captive was presently being treated to a glass of wine, and looking with half frightened, half puzzled eyes at the previously deserted village street, now filling with ration parties, ambulance men, dispatch carriers, and various nondiscreet onlookers. He was a tall fellow, very young, fresh-faced, and with fair hair. What a shame to have to shoot at such people, went through my head as I saw him. Soon a long line of stretchers arrived at the dressing station. A lot of wounded men had come from the Monchy south as well, because the enemy had also succeeded in breaking into the line, briefly, in E sector. One of the assailants must have been an amazing character. He had leapt into the trench, apparently unremarked, and ran along it, past the backs of the sentry, who all had their eyes on the field in front of them. One after another, he leapt on them from behind. The gas masks had restricted further their field of vision, and having felled a number of them with blows of a club or rifle butt, returned, equally unremarked, to the British lines. When the trench was tidied up later, 8 sentries were found with broken skulls. I wanted to share that quick passage with you because this serves a couple purposes for us as historians. First, it shows us what it was like to be on the front line in the Somme sector as a German. Lots of poison gas, unrelenting fighting beginning from dark in the morning till dark at night, raiding parties, brutal hand-to-hand fighting. So it wasn't just the Allies who had things rough during the Somme. War is a great equalizer, and it is hell for everybody who has to experience it. So it's important. It's important to learn both sides of the story when it comes to conflict, as well as any history. The other thing that this passage really shows that I wanted to bring was, again, these are not the words of a man overcome with bloodlust. These are the words of a man who really values bravery in combat, looks at it with pragmatic austerity from a Prussian background. If you serve well, if you serve honorably, you're worthy of his admiration, whether you're on the other side or on his own side. And as he says, as he's looking at this British captive, it's a pity that we have to shoot at these people. But within that quote is the implication that Ernst Junger is duty bound to shoot at, the enemy. He's duty bound to do what he can, to serve his country and serve his honor to the greatest of his ability. Moving on in the book to the final selection from Junger's writing that I want to share with you today. And we are skipping through the majority of this book, and this book is really quite a wonderful historical account in its own right, as well as a literary account. There's a reason this book is canon for First World War historians. So if you want to read the whole book, by all means, get the book. It's not expensive, and it will really inform you about not only what the German side was like, but what World War I was like in general. That being said, back to the book, the final selection I want to share with you is a personal interest of mine. I am very, very fascinated with the Third Ypres Offensive of 1917, commonly referred to as the Passchendaele Offensive, where Flanders and the Ypres salient was the source, the source of some of the most ferocious fighting of the entire war. If you don't know about Passchendaele, you can look at one of my first videos I put up on the channel, Passchendaele, Hell on Earth, the photo essay. It's a collection of photographs that I feel really exemplify the campaign, set to some really wonderful music. from cinematic soundtracks. This account from Ernst Junger's book is the German perspective of what it was like to fight in the Third Ypres as a defender against the relenting onslaught in some of the worst conditions of the war. And Junger writes, "My view was somewhat restricted because we were swathed in thick smoke. The shelling grew more imposing by the minute, and soon reached that climactic stage that was so thrilling as to produce an almost amused indifference. The earth showered on our roof incessantly. Twice the building itself was hit. Incendiaries threw up heavy milk-white clouds, out of which fiery streaks dribbled on the ground. A piece of that phosphoric mass smacked down to a stone at my feet, and I was able to watch it burn for minutes. Later on, we were told that men it had landed on rolled around on the ground without being able to quench the flames. Delay shells drilled themselves into the ground with a roar, throwing up flat casks of earth. Swaths of gas and fog crept slowly across the terrain. Rifle and machine gun fire rang out from just ahead of us, a sign that the enemy must be ahead and very near. Down on the bend of the Steenbeek, a group of men were wading through the constantly changing scenery of leaping geysers of mud. I saw among them a battalion commander, Captain von Brixen, with a bandaged arm being supported by 2 ambulancemen. I hurried down to him. He called to warn me that the enemy were pressing forward, and I should see that I found cover quickly. Before long, the first infantry bullets were smacking into the surrounding craters or bursting against masonry debris. More and more fleeing figures were disappearing into the haze behind us, while furious rifle fire spoke for the implacable defense of those holding on further forward. The hour was at hand. We had to defend the Rattenberg, and I told the men, some of whom looked troubled, that we were not about to run away. They were allotted various loopholes, and our one and only machine gun was set up in a window opening. A crater was designated as a dressing station, and a stretcher bearer, who before long found himself with plenty of work on his hands, sat in it. I picked up a rifle off the floor and hung a belt of cartridges around my neck. As our band was very small, I tried to bolster it from numbers of those who were drifting around leaderless. Most of them heard our appeal willingly enough, glad of the chance to join in somewhere, while others hurried on their way, having stopped in disbelief and seen what poor prospects we offered. It was no time for niceties. I ordered my men to aim at them. Magnetically drawn by the barrels of the rifles, they slowly came nearer, even though one could see from their expressions that they were not really most reluctant to keep us company. There were various excuses, prevarications, more or less compelling arguments. But I don't even have a gun. Then wait till someone gets shot and use his. In the course of one last intensification of shelling, during which the ruins of the house were struck several times, and the pieces of brick came hurtling down on our helmets, I was thrown to the ground by a fearful blow. To the amazement of our men, I picked myself up unhurt. After that titanic final drum roll, things got quieter. The shelling now passed over our heads, onto the Langemark-Beschut road. We weren't even that happy to see it, for so far we hadn't seen the wood for the trees. The danger had come down on us on such a massive scale that in so many guises that we couldn't really begin to cope with it. After the storm had passed over our heads, everyone had time to prepare themselves for what inevitably must come. And come it did. The guns ahead of us fell silent. The defenders had been finished off. Out of the haze, a dense line of men began to approach. My men shot, concealed behind the ruins. The machine gun was clicking away. As though smeared away, the attackers disappeared into craters and tied us down by their return fire. On either flank, strong detachments began to march forward. Before long, we were surrounded by rifles. The situation was hopeless. There was no point in merely sacrificing the soldiers. I gave the order to withdraw. Now it was difficult to get the committed and tenacious soldiers to stop. Taking advantage of a long cloud of smoke that hung down near the water, we made good our escape, partly wading through the streams whose water went up to our hips. Through the noose around us was all but drawn tight. We still squirmed our way out. I was the last man out of our little strong point, supporting Lieutenant Holman, who was bleeding badly from a wound in his head, but still making jokes at his own expense. So that is the last selection from this book that I'm going to read in this podcast. I found it very interesting for, again, a variety of reasons. First and foremost, it takes place in a battle that, I'm going to admit I am very interested in. It is the Battle of Passchendaele, the Third Ypres offensive, and this is the German perspective. It's very interesting to read this because one of the tactics the Germans employed during the Third Ypres offensive was a defense in depth tactic, where you did not have a single trench line like we explored in the first passage of the book that I read. The ground of Flanders at this time in the war was just so waterlogged, muddy, and bogged down. It was very difficult to maintain a single trench line. Also, the Germans found that due to the Allied adaptations to fighting such a defensive line of just a single trench with supporting trenches behind it, they found that if you had a series of pillboxes and supporting earthworks kind of set up, scattered along a general line, they found that for this terrain at this point in the war, that was the most effective defensive technique against fighting an Allied advance. And here you see, Junger states the defenses in front of us had fallen silent, and that people were falling back. And the German line was actually set up to do this. If one bunker failed, there would be two bunkers behind it covering the route of advance. This was a very, very deadly form of defense that the Allies ran into when they were trying to take ground during the Third Ypres. And that's part of why the Allies were unable to achieve the goals of that campaign, which was essentially to swing around north, reach the Belgian coast, and destroy the German front line in Belgium, opening up a route to completely outflank the German line in France. This never happened in the Third Ypres. It just turned into this massive quagmire of guys being killed for no reason in the mud. It was a very sad, continues to be an incredibly sad chapter in human history, but unfortunately one that most histories are written by the victor. They are written from the English perspective. Very, very little is written about the Third Ypres from the German perspective. So here's Ernst Junger on the front line, as usual, doing what he really, after reading the book, I have found him to be most at home at, the front line, leading men in combat, leading men in desperate situations. You see his Prussian attitude of military service and military honor, where he fully gives accolade to the men who, like this Lieutenant Holman, who was bleeding badly from a wound to the head but still making jokes. This is the kind of man that Ernst Junger respects, compared to the soldiers who are, falling back and running away and making excuses. I would find some of these excuses to be compelling, such as, I don't have a firearm, how am I going to fight? Well, Ernst Junger just had his own men threaten to shoot these guys because they were behaving dishonorably, they were not upholding their duty. So he obviously has a line that separates those he respects, those he doesn't. He's obviously grateful that these guys who are falling back, who he threatened with guns, joined him. But as you can see, his tone changes between the kinds of people he's encountering here in this battle. So we're learning a little bit more about who Junger is as a person. He mentions just kind of an interesting fact. Ernst Junger mentions phosphoric, artillery shells that come in. He is talking about white phosphorus, which is continued to be used by militaries today. It burns at thousands, plural, of degrees Fahrenheit. It's essentially a kind of explosive that burns incredibly hot. It produces a thick white smoke. It's technically used as a smoke generation device. They make phosphoric grenades. They make phosphor artillery shells to throw up white smoke very quickly. However, since this explodes and it sends little pieces of burning gelatin at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit, it can't be extinguished unless its source of oxygen is cut off. So it will just continue to burn through wood, flesh, or bone until it runs out of itself, until it expends itself. So he's talking about that. So again, just the brutal nature of fighting in the First World War. We have guys getting shelled with white phosphorus, Germans being shelled with white phosphorus, rolling around on the ground, Junger says, without being able to quench the flames. He doesn't call it white phosphorus. He calls it phosphoric mass, but I can recognize that's what they're being hit with here is white phosphorus, and it is some terrible stuff. And just kind of as a quick note on that stuff, phosphoric artifacts for collecting reasons are some of the rarest, hardest to get pieces of inert ordnance, because nobody wants to have a live phosphor grenade on their display of World War I, World War II, or any other, because they use it so much and continue to use it, any other display, because, God, the stuff is just so dangerous. It's not just like a fragmentation grenade, which in itself is horrifically dangerous, but can be made inert rather easily by removing the explosives out of the grenade and rendering the fuse inoperable. You then have a nice grenade you can display that looks just the same. A phosphor grenade is like, I believe you have to render it inert in an oxygen-deprived environment, because as soon as white phosphorus is exposed to oxygen, it begins to burn. It's incredibly unstable, incredibly dangerous, and phosphor artifacts for displays in museums or in private collections are very hard to find. So if you find something that's white phosphorus, be very, very careful, people. Be very, very careful. That being said, that is my thoughts on that last passage of the book. My thoughts on Ernst Junger, Storm of Steel, one of the best literary works regarding the First World War of all time, one of the most impactful books on the First World War due to historical content as well as just how well it's written. It's out there. It's very easy to find. It's very affordable. And as I said, just understand who Ernst Junger is. You're going to get a lot more out of the book than if you start thinking, in terms of just, your own experience, who he is. It's also going to tell you a lot about, the typical German soldier during the First World War, the typical German officer during the First World War. Going to give you an excellent view into what things were like from the other side of the trench line during the First World War. That is going to be everything for this podcast, number 9, Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger. If you want, go ahead and check out my other podcasts on modern military history, YouTube, or you can go to modernmilitaryhistory.com and check out some of the articles I have there. There's going to be more videos coming, more podcasts coming. I really appreciate your viewership and listening to my ramblings as always. This is Andy, signing off.